And now on Nights with Steve Price from the 50-Up Club, Christopher Zinn.
Yes, indeed. We talk to Chris every Thursday night. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Steve, and yourself.
Very well, thanks. Now, we're going to talk, we often talk about things that interest people who are over the age of 50. The electricity prices is one of the big issues. You've done polling on this. It's one of the real touchstone issues for people. Their electricity bill, they can't control it now, these days. It keeps going up. You're on a fixed income that kills you every day. So, what's the solution?
Well, look, we've seen in the past 1.5 million households have rooftop solar, and many of them who got in early enough when there was the generous feed-in tariff have done very well, but people still keep coming. So the issue now is about batteries and storage and actually how you can keep that electricity and use it. So I think there's lots of people looking at this much more closely. Is it worth me getting one of these new whiz batteries and the technology so I can actually store the electricity and perhaps even go off grid? So there's some very interesting technologies which, as they say, are disrupting the whole notion of the grid and the network that we've had.
Well, we'll get calls on this because our audience is vitally interested in this issue, and a lot of our audience are, in fact, keen on having solar on the roof and being able to store it. But is that battery technology, does it actually exist?
It does, and Tesla is a brand that some people might have heard. They're about to offer something into the Australian market. About $10,000 is what it's going to cost you for the average household, apparently, and that's for the battery, which mounts on the exterior of a wall, and the inverter, which sort of converts the DC to AC to use at the kind of voltages that you're used to. So that's the kind of price of entry, and I suppose one of the big debates is what is the payback period, i.e. how much do you save in what amount of time to actually pay for that sort of quite sizable investment. And because the cost of the technology is tipped of the batteries to drop by about 50% over the next 4 years, they're saying that actually, the payback, and it does depend where you live and how much sun, but, could be fall from, 10 years to 7.5 to 5 years. And but as that happens, more and more people will find it more and more attractive.
So with these battery storage systems, how much can you store?
Well, it depends
how
many...
does it actually work?
Yeah. Well, how it works is at the moment, if you have solar panels, you have to use it directly, and that which you don't use goes into the grid, and you get paid a feed-in tariff. And as I've said, for those people who came into the system early enough, you might get 50 or 60 cents per kilowatt hour, as opposed to about 8 cents for people who are late into the deal, and that does depend where you live. Now, the point is those generous feed-in tariffs are finishing for many people next year. So again, they might look more closely at this idea of getting one of these batteries. And they are very huge and very large, but technologically a whole different kind of thing than we've had before. So essentially, instead of you making electricity on your rooftop, which you sell, you actually can store it and use it through the day, and that would substantially reduce your bill, perhaps to the extent where you don't need to be on the grid in the ideal world. But I have to say there are, as usual, tricks and traps for the unwary.
Well, this is the classic disruptor business if this happens, because power companies clearly don't want people to be generating their own electricity, storing it and using it, because that then cuts them out altogether. Won't they want to get into this space and try and own it themselves?
And they are, and in fact, AGL has a $10,000 offer, so you can actually go with them already, and that's the battery and the inverter. The issue really is not so much with the electricity retailers, but the networks, because the argument is, as more and more people go off grid, and many people have expressed that either to be independent or not have to pay the high cost of electricity, there is still the cost of the network and paying it off over decades and decades. That will fall more and more to those who do not have rooftop solar or batteries, and they'll be paying a higher fixed cost. And I think, as we've discussed before, electricity is made of the rate, the variable cost, the actual amount of electricity you use, but then there is the fixed daily amount, which over time has been getting more and more, and that can be the real killer, especially for older people who live alone. They're paying the same daily rate as a family who's using much more electricity, so the impact on them is much greater.
So that's domestic electricity and home usage. Big industry. Do you see a point where they're going to then start to create their own electricity and try and make it and store it in a much bigger scale?
Look, I'm sure that we're talking domestically, industrially, and commercially. We've already seen in terms of rooftop solar with large factory areas, they've got into that. I'm sure it would be the case for this. It really is going to change a great deal. The key point is, what does the battery storage cost? And while there are predictions that it'll drop, that does remain to be seen. It's still a very costly investment, but there are more and more people who want to make it. And I heard on a documentary, town in northern New South Wales who want $7 million so they can all go off grid and all exist with batteries and solar panels. So, but as it does come at a substantial cost, and we still do need a grid. And it's also argued that the problem is, if you go off grid, you cannot sell any surplus electricity that you have or give it back to the grid because it's essentially wasted. And many of the people who do this are driven by an environmental imperative. And, so if you go off the grid, all the excess that you generate, you can't actually use. So it essentially goes to waste as opposed to displacing the use that someone else might make of it.
I can see the scare campaign coming against this.
Yeah, look, I think that, there are scares, as I've said, in terms of what's called the death spiral of the networks, i.e., as the costs go up of being on the grid, more and more people would move to batteries and solar systems. Hence, those left on the grid would have to pay a greater amount, and that would cause more migration to batteries, et cetera, et cetera. So that's called the death spiral, which does seem to worry a lot of the economists and the electricity companies. I mean, I would say that in New South Wales, where we are, electricity networks, some of them are up for sale or a 100-year lease. The government's relying on a good price for those for all sorts of infrastructure they want to build. But while there is uncertainty in terms of these kind of developments hovering over the network, it wouldn't seem to me that is necessarily going to drive the highest of prices, be it overseas investors or from wherever.
So the other thing is, you go off the grid, though, and you put your panels on your roof, you've got your battery storage, and we have an unseasonally, non-sunny winter. If you're not connected at all, you don't have that grid backup, do you?
Exactly. And look, while there might be room for generators, small generators, to top up the batteries or whatever.
Sure, I'd love to be living in a suburb where suddenly, 200 generators kick in.
Look, I think it's quite an analogous situation to mobile phones and landlines. People use mobiles a lot, but many people, myself included, still hang on to a landline for whatever reason because it's robust. It's nearly always there. Everyone can use it, and certainly while one pays a cost to that, as long as it doesn't become prohibitive, you'll hang on. And I perhaps would see that in terms of the grid as well. Some people, for ideological or independence reasons, might want to pull away from it. That's fine, but there is a convenience that we have grown very used to of 24/7 reliable electricity that might not be there in the same way when you're relying on solar panels and batteries.
Good to catch up with you as usual, Christopher Zinn. Thanks for your help tonight.
Likewise, Steve. All the best. Bye.
Christopher Zinn from 50Up Club.